Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into a massive, 2,000-year-old literary mystery. We're talking about the origins of four ancient, absolutely world-changing texts, the Gospels of the New Testament. But look, instead of just reading them as ancient scripture like we usually do, we're going to treat them right now like an active, forensic crime scene. We've got texts, we've got sources, and we have this incredible, giant puzzle that scholars have been literally obsessing over for generations. Let's get into it.
Okay, so let's kick off this investigation by looking at the first three books, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. When you lay these texts side by side, you immediately have to ask yourself a huge question. Why in the world do they share so much identical wording? I mean, they often present the exact same stories, in the exact same order, using the exact same phrasing. It's uncanny. But then there's a fourth book, and it completely, totally breaks the mold. Scholars actually have a name for this puzzle. They call it the Synoptic problem, and it's basically a forensic attempt to figure out who copied from whom and exactly what sources they all shared. The word synoptic basically just means seeing together, because Matthew, Mark, and Luke view the life of Jesus through a remarkably similar lens. But because there are also these minor, conflicting details, like a slightly different timeline here or a shifted perspective there, scholars have spent decades trying to track down the ancient paper trail.
So how do we solve this? Well, scholars generally rely on two main theories to make sense of the paper trail. First up is the two-source theory, which suggests Mark was the earliest text, and then Matthew and Luke use it as a baseline alongside a second, kind of mysterious source. Then, building on that, we have the four-source theory. This one suggests that Matthew and Luke also had their own unique independent sources. You'll often hear these called Matthew and Luke, with simply meaning the original or primitive draft of the text.
Now enter the elusive Q source. It gets its name from the German word Quelle, which just means source. And guys, this is the crucial missing piece of evidence. You see, there are about 170 shared segments between Matthew and Luke that are completely missing from Mark. So scholars hypothesize that Q was this early written collection of Jesus' sayings that both authors somehow had independent access to. It's like the holy grail of biblical archaeology.
But hang on, why write any of this down at all? For decades, these stories were passed around purely by word of mouth. But three massive catalysts forced a sudden, urgent shift from spoken stories to written scrolls. First, the original eyewitness apostles were starting to pass away, meaning the community's living, breathing fact-checkers were disappearing. Second, early heresies, like Gnosticism, were creeping in, so they really needed a definitive, written record to squash the misinformation. And third, the early church was just growing so massively, they plainly needed structural organization to train all their new leaders.
All right, so while the first three books heavily overlap to solve the synoptic problem, the book of John just goes completely rogue. Look at this breakdown. An overwhelming 92% of John's gospel is entirely unique material. 92%. It portrays Jesus from a completely different, highly theological perspective, overlapping with the other three accounts by a mere 8%.
And that brings us to our primary investigation for today. The text of this fourth account, John, never actually explicitly names its author. No title page, no signature. So we are going to gather forensic clues from the text itself to unmask the anonymous author of this rogue account. We're on the hunt for a writer who is operating completely independently of the whole synoptic tradition we just talked about.
Okay, clue number one. The author possesses this incredibly deep insider knowledge of Jewish customs. I mean, this isn't someone just looking in from the outside. They know hyper-specific purification rituals at weddings, like the exact size of the stone water jars used at Cana. They also uniquely mention the winter feast of dedication, which we know as Hanukkah. That's a festival not even found in the Old Testament, but it was deeply embedded in Jewish tradition from the Maccabean period. Our writer knows their stuff. Let's dig a little deeper into those customs. The author didn't just casually summarize a funeral. They reported on specific, minute forensic details. When describing the resurrection of a man named Lazarus, the author mentions his hands and feet being wrapped with strips of linen, and crucially, they mention a sudarium, face cloth. They even go out of their way to note how this specific cloth was folded separately later on at Jesus' own empty tomb. This level of detail strongly indicates they weren't just summarizing secondhand info. They were standing right there, observing these Jewish burial customs firsthand.
Moving on to clue number 2. Our suspect is clearly a local Palestinian topographical expert. They know the exact, precise layout of Jerusalem's streets and the local architecture. They navigate the geography like a native who has literally walked every single inch of the region. And the geography evidence backs this up perfectly. For instance, they clarify there are two completely different towns called Bethany, just so the reader doesn't get confused. They know the locals claimed it took exactly 46 years to build Herod's temple, but the most stunning detail for me? They mention the Pool of Bethesda had exactly 5 covered colonnades. Now, for centuries, critics thought this was completely made up, until archaeologists actually dug up the pool in Jerusalem and found, yep, you guessed it, exactly 5 colonnades. This writer literally walked those ancient streets.
Our third clue reveals an author who obsessively records minor details that only someone physically present would ever notice or remember. At one point, the writer explicitly says, "We beheld his glory," placing themselves squarely right in the middle of the narrative.
Just notice how our mystery author is the only one who actually knows the victim's name in this chaotic garden arrest scene. The other Gospels, they just mention someone getting their ear cut off. But our author? They know the guy's name was Malchus. That is the ultimate hallmark of an on-the-scene witness. I mean, you don't get the specific name of a low-level servant unless you were standing close enough to the altercation to actually recognize him, right?
And then there's this. 153. It is one of the most oddly specific numbers in all of ancient literature. After the resurrection, the disciples have this miraculous catch of fish. And what kind of person stops to count exactly 153 fish pulled from the Sea of Galilee, rather than just saying they caught a lot or a heavy net full?
Well, counting exact fish yields a massive clue for clue number 4. Our suspect is absolutely a professional fisherman. To a fisherman, the exact count of the catch is literally everything. It's their livelihood, it's their pride, it's their metric of success. This immediately points us toward the inner circle of Jesus' disciples, specifically those who made their living as fishermen on the Sea of Galilee. The plot thickens with our 5th clue. The author actually goes out of their way to brag about outrunning Peter in a foot race to the empty tomb. The text specifically points out that they reached the tomb first, but, let Peter go inside. It's this incredibly human, almost petty, sibling-like rivalry with Peter, who was the prominent leader of the early church.
And that brings us to our 6th and final clue. The most intimate detail happens right at the crucifixion. While suffering an agonizing death, Jesus looks down, explicitly bypasses Peter, and trusts the specific disciple to take care of his own mother, Mary. He says, "Here is your mother." This level of profound, family-like trust requires an impossibly close inner circle relationship.
Section Unmasking the Suspect, the Apostle John.
So when you combine the professional fisherman background, those obsessive eyewitness details, the intimate inner circle access, and the topographical knowledge, John the Apostle perfectly fits our forensic profile. He fits the mold of the renegade 4th author who didn't need to copy from the Synoptics because, well, he lived it himself. Yet the most profound takeaway from this whole explainer is how John actually refers to himself in the text. He never uses his own name. Out of all his accomplishments, out of all the incredible, history-altering things he witnessed, he chooses to solely identify himself with just this one phrase, the disciple whom Jesus loved.
As we wrap up this literary investigation, I want to leave you with this final thought. Think about how this author navigated the chaos, the trauma, and the eventual rise of a massive global movement. He didn't root his identity in being an author, or a leader, or even an eyewitness. He rooted it entirely in being loved. So how radically would your life change if, like this ancient author, you framed your entire existence around that same core identity? Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.